She rose before the rest of the household staff, slipped out through the servants' gate, and went looking for the old woman she had overheard by the well. Not to sell another rumor this time, but because something in her would not let her rest until she understood what she had actually set in motion. She never found the allergy that morning. By the time she reached the market, the old woman had already gone into hiding, and General Ojo's men were moving quietly through the streets. But Morenike's restless conscience would matter later, in ways she could not yet imagine, because a servant girl who begins to doubt the comfortable lies of a palace is rarely satisfied staying silent for long, and what she chose to do with that doubt would not end with a handful of coins. By nightfall, Chief Fabure knew that somewhere in his city, an old woman was whispering that the dead prince was not dead at all. Here is where you should lean in a little closer, because everything Fabure had built for 20 years now depended on how fast he could silence a rumor before it grew legs and started walking through the palace halls on its own. Fabure was not a man who panicked. 20 years of patient scheming had taught him that panic kills plans faster than enemies do. He summoned his most loyal enforcer, a scarred former soldier named Salako, and gave him a single, quiet instruction: find the old woman spreading these lies, and find the beggar she claims is royal blood, and make sure neither of them lives to see the coronation. But Fagore made one mistake that night, the same mistake almost every man who has built his power on lies eventually makes. He underestimated how many people had been quietly waiting 20 years for a reason to turn against him. Because General Balogun Ojo, the aging commander of the palace guard, had served under the true king Obademi long before Fagure's rise, and though he had never quite voiced his suspicions aloud, he had never quite believed the story of that fire. Too convenient, he always thought privately. Too clean. A fire that killed a prince and two servants, but left no bodies clear enough to properly mourn, or burned goods brought before the priests for the customary rites. He had buried his doubts for 20 years out of fear and old age and the simple exhaustion of a man who no longer had the strength to fight a war he wasn't sure he could win. But when Salako, Fagure's enforcer, came to the guard barracks that night, asking for two men to help him deal with a troublesome beggar and an old woman spreading dangerous lies, General Ojo's 20 years of buried suspicion finally cracked open. He did not confront Salako. He simply asked with practiced calm, "What beggar? What old woman? What lies?" And Salako, never imagining the aging general posed any threat, told him everything Faguri had told him: that a beggar in the market was claiming royal blood, that an old palace servant named Iyalaje was behind it all, and that both needed to disappear quietly before sunrise. General Ojo excused himself, walked calmly back to his private chambers, and once the door was shut, sat down heavily in the dark, his hands trembling for the first time in decades. 20 years of guilt he had buried under duty rose up all at once. If there was even the smallest chance that the prince he had failed to protect 20 years ago was alive tonight, he was not going to fail him a second time. He gathered three men he trusted absolutely, men whose fathers had served the old king Fagure had never fully bought, and together, under cover of darkness, they moved through the city faster than Salako's men, reaching Iyalaje's small wood house before Fagure's assassins arrived. She was packing a small bundle of belongings, preparing, with the instinct of a woman who had survived one royal purge but ready to flee before daylight. When General Ojo appeared at her door, she nearly collapsed from fear, certain her death had finally come. Iyalaje made her choice the way she had made every difficult choice in her life, quickly and with her whole chest. She told General Ojo, "Yeah, I am not here to harm you," Ojo said quickly before she could scream. "I served your king. I have waited 20 years for a reason to believe the fire was a lie. Tell me now, is it true? Is the boy alive?" And here, Right here at the edge of dawn, with danger closing from both directions, is where the story turns fully. Because if the general's loyalty was real, it meant the beggar boy suddenly had something he had never had in 20 years of poverty, someone with power on his side. But if it was a trap, a final test set by Fagure to flush out the last hiding place of the truth, then Yalaje's next words would be the ones that finally got both her and Kayode killed. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't going to move slow from here. So let's keep going, because the next part is where everything either falls apart or comes together, and I promise you, it's worth staying for. Iyalaje told General Ojo everything. The fire that was no accident, the seventh cloth she'd wrapped a 9-year-old prince in, 20 years of silence bought with the boy's suffering as a beggar in the very city that once bowed to his father. General Ojo did not weep, though something in his old soldier's face broke quietly at the confirmation. Where is he now? He asked. By the old well behind the cloth market, she said, if Agure's men have not already found him. They had not, but only by miracle. When General Ojo and his men reached the well, they found Kayode being dragged into an alley by two of Salaku's soldiers, a knife already drawn, the beggar boy fighting for his life with nothing but bare hands against trained killers. Ojo's men arrived just in time, cutting down one soldier and forcing the other to flee into the dark, leaving Kayode bleeding but alive, gasping in the dirt for the second time in 2 days. Who are you? Kayode managed to ask, staring up at the armored general standing over him. Someone who should have protected you 20 years ago and failed, Ojo said. And tonight, I intend to make up for that failure if you let me. There was no time for long explanations. Dawn was less than 3 hours away, and with it, the coronation of a false king. Ojo made a decision that terrified even him. Instead of hiding Kayode away for another 20 years of quiet safety, he decided the truth had to be spoken in the one place it could never be buried again, the throne room itself, in front of the entire court, on the very morning Kunle was meant to be crowned.
Oh, where's my mom's band-aid? Ouch. How long did your brothers all sleep together?
Iyalaji limping beside them, refusing to be left behind after 20 years of silence. Fagbore will simply try again next month, next year, until he succeeds. The only way you survive this is if the whole kingdom knows the truth at once, before he can silence it. Coyote, still weak, still bleeding, still barely able to believe he was a prince and not a beggar, asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. And if we don't believe an old woman and a bleeding beggar over the word of a chief who has ruled this kingdom for 20 years, Iyalaji answered before Ojo could. Queen Yeside is still alive. She has lived in quiet exile for 2 decades, but she is still alive, and no elder in this kingdom would dare call the king's old widow a liar to her face, not without proof stronger than her word. And I have proof. I kept it all these years hidden beneath the floor of my house. The signet ring your father wore the night of the fire. I pulled it from the ashes before I ran, though I never understood why I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. There it was, the object that would either save 3 lives or end them by sunrise. They moved through the palace's servant passages, the same corridors Iyalaje had once carried a frightened 9-year-old through, and reached the outskirts of the throne room just as the first grey light of dawn touched the horizon. The court had already begun to gather, nobles in their finest clothes, priests preparing the ceremonial items, and at the center of it all, dressed in the robes he and Ruth were rightfully his, stood Kunle, 20 years old, utterly unaware that everything he believed about his own identity was about to be shattered in front of the entire kingdom. Fabure stood beside his son, beaming with the pride of a man who believed his 20-year plan had finally reached its conclusion. He had no idea that the beggar he'd ordered killed hours earlier was still breathing, standing 30 feet away, hidden behind a pillar, waiting for the exact moment his mother would walk in. Because that was the last piece of General Ojo's plan. Someone had gone in the deepest hour of the night to the small, quiet residence where Queen Yesterday had lived in forgotten exile for 20 years and told her, gently but urgently, that her son might be alive and that if she wanted to see the truth revealed, she needed to come to the palace at dawn, one final time, as the mother of the king, rather than a discarded widow. She arrived just as the priest began the opening chants of the coronation ceremony, dressed simply, her hair grey now, her spine straighter than it had been in years, despite 2 decades of quiet grief. She did not announce herself with shouting or spectacle. She simply walked, slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle of the throne room, and the entire court fell into uneasy silence at the sight of a woman they had all been told to forget. Faguere's smile faltered for the first time in 20 years. Queen Yesterday, he said carefully, forcing warmth into his voice. This is an unexpected honor, though I fear you have arrived on the wrong day for old grievances. Today, we crown a new king. Yes, Yesterday said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Tell me, Fagore, whose son do you crown today? The question hung in the air like smoke that refuses to clear. My distant cousin, Fagore said smoothly. The lie
Hey,
so
Jason.
practiced it barely required thought. Not
Hey,
of the royal line, as the elders have confirmed many
what's up?
times over these past few years.
Mm-hmm.
Then you will not object, Yesterday said, if I ask the priest to examine him for the mark all true sons of this bloodline carry beneath the collarbone, the leopard's
Which,
paw. My husband carried it, my son carried it. Surely, if Kunle is
the
truly of
Wednesday and
royal blood,
Thursday?
he carries it too.
Okay.
The silence that followed was the kind that makes grown men's hearts stop. Fagore's mind raced because he knew with absolute certainty that his son carried no such mark, because his son was not, had never been of royal blood at all. 20 years of careful forgery, bribed elders, and rewritten lineage records had built a lie strong enough to fool an entire court, but it could not fool a birthmark that either existed or didn't. This is
Okay.
beneath the
Yeah,
dignity
that,
of a
yeah,
coronation,
I could,
Fagore said quickly, too
now,
quickly,
but the
his
only
composure
thing is,
cracking at the edges. The queen's grief
I
has
could not
clearly
do,
disturbed her mind.
this coming
Guards,
Thursday.
escort her. Let her speak. General Ojo's voice boomed from the back of the
Yeah.
hall, and every head turned as he stepped
Yeah.
forward,
I could,
flanked
yeah.
by
Yeah,
armed
next
men
week,
loyal to the
Wednesday,
queen.
Thursday, and okay. Yeah,
Let the
that's
queen
fine.
finish,
Yeah.
Fagore, unless you have something to fear from the simple question. Fagore understood, in that single terrible moment, that
It
his
just
general,
depends. I have to
his
look and
own
see,
palace
like,
guard,
see how
had
much,
turned
money I
against
have
him.
to make, because
The
with my Social
foundation of
Security, I have
20
to be
years of the palace
careful.
trembled beneath his feet.
Yeah.
And then Iyalaje stepped out from behind
Yeah,
the pillar.
but
No longer
I
alone,
definitely will
an
look into
old
it.
woman
Yeah,
standing
with
tall
everything else
beside
is fine.
trembling
Yeah.
hands, holding a small object wrapped in cloth
Oh,
that
no
she had
problem.
kept safe for 20
All right.
years. Shifagore knows exactly why the mark matters, she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the court. Because 20 years ago, on the night the true prince was supposedly killed in a fire, I carried that same prince alive out of the flames and hid him as a beggar in this very city to save his life from the man who ordered his death. Gasps rippled through the court like wind through tall grass. Lies, Fagore snarled, all pretense of calm finally abandoned. The desperate lies of a mad old woman trying to disrupt a lawful coronation. Then you will not object, Iyalaje said, to him showing his own chest as proof of his innocence, before I show you the mark of the boy I saved. She turned toward the pillar and called softly into the shadows, come forward, it's time. And Coyote stepped into the throne room of Ife for the first time in 20 years, bruised, bleeding, dressed in rags, but walking with a straightened spine because for the first time in his life, he understood exactly who he was. The court did not laugh at him this time. The court fell utterly silent because every eye present could see, even beneath dirt and dry blood, half forgotten in the palace's outer halls. He pulled back his torn collar without being asked, revealing revealing the leopard's paw birthmark beneath his collarbone, and Queen Yesterday, who had spent 20 years believing her son had burned to death in front of her, let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but something older and deeper than either, the sound of 2 decades of grief finally breaking apart in a single instant. She crossed the hall faster than her aged legs should have allowed, and gathered her son into her arms in front of the entire court. And for a long moment, no one in that throne room spoke, because everyone present understood they were witnessing something no life, however carefully built, could survive. Fagure understood it too, and in the chaos of that moment, he reached for the ceremonial dagger at his side, the one meant for the coronation ritual, and lunged not at Kayode, but at Queen Yesterday herself, screaming that if the truth could not be buried, then the last living proof of the old bloodline would die with the secret. General Ojo was faster. He stepped between the chief and the queen just as Fabure came through the hall, taking the hold meant for her across his own forearm, and in the same motion, the soldier seized Fabure before he could strike again, wresting the dagger from his grip as the man who had ruled Ife in shadows for 20 years finally screamed the truth aloud himself in the madness of his final unraveling, admitting in front of every noble and priest in the hall exactly what he had done to seize a throne that was never his. Kule, who had believed his entire life that he was born to rule, stood frozen at the center of the hall, watching his father confess to murder, betrayal, and 20 years of fabricated bloodlines, understanding in the space of a single unbearable moment that everything he had ever believed about himself was built on his father's lies. He did not resist when the guards moved to restrain him too, though everyone in that hall, even Kayode, could see that the young man was not a villain, only a son who had inherited a crime he never knew he was committing. That is not where this story ends easily though, because nothing this heavy resolves without cost. Fabure was stripped of his title and imprisoned to await judgment before the Council of Elders, his 20 years of quiet power collapsing into disgrace in a single morning. Kunle, though innocent of his father's original crimes, could not remain in a court that no longer trusted the very bloodline he'd been raised to believe in. He was exiled, not executed, sent from the only life he had ever known to build something new far from Ife's throne, carrying the weight of a father's sins he never chose. And Kayode, no, Prince Adewale, restored now to the name Iya Alaji had stripped him from 20 years ago to save his life, was crowned not that same morning, but 3 weeks later, once the court had properly mourned what was lost and properly celebrated what was found. He insisted, against the protests of several elders, that Iya Alaje sit beside the throne during the ceremony, not as a servant, but as the woman who had given up her own peace for 20 decades to keep a 9-year-old boy alive long enough to become a king. She wept through the entire coronation, not from joy alone, but from the release of 20 years of guilt she had carried for turning a prince into a beggar to save his life, a burden she finally set down. General Ojo recovered from his wound slowly and was named the new king's most trusted advisor, the one man in the palace who had chosen loyalty to a memory over safety in a life. And Morenike, the seventh girl whose loose tongue had nearly gotten a beggar and an old woman killed, came forward on her own 3 days after the coronation and confessed everything to General Ojo before anyone else could accuse her. She did not have to. No one had traced the look back to her, and she could easily have stayed silent and safe. But the same restlessness that had sent her out at dawn looking for Iyalaje would not let her enjoy a throne room's peace built partly on her own carelessness. King Adewale listened to her confession in silence, and when she finished, trembling, waiting for punishment, he asked her only one question: why tell me now when you could have said nothing? because I have spent my whole life watching this palace bury truths that were inconvenient, and I did not want to become one more person who let a lie live because speaking was dangerous. He did not punish her. He made her a steward of the royal household, the youngest in the kingdom's memory, because a king who had spent 20 years buried by other people's silence understood better than anyone the rare value of someone willing to break it, even imperfectly, even too late to undo the damage her first choice had nearly caused. But Adewale, for all the joy of his restoration, was not the same boy who had been carried out of a burning room 20 years ago. 20 years of hunger, 20 years of being spat on and beaten and dismissed as nobody had carved something into him that no throne could soon do. He ruled in the years that followed as a king who never forgot what it felt like to be thrown into the dust outside his own gate, a king who fed beggars at his palace door with his own hands because he remembered always exactly what it meant to be one. And sometimes, late at night, long after the court had gone to sleep, he would sit by the old well behind the cloth market, alone, in simple cloth instead of royal robes, and remember the 9-year-old boy who once believed he had no name at all, because some truths, once carried that deep, never fully let go of the person who survived them. Word reached him years later of Kunle, the young man who had once stood where Adewale now stood, dressed in robes meant for a coronation that would never come. Kunle had traveled far from Ife, past the borders of every kingdom that had ever heard whispers of his father's disgrace, and built a quiet life for himself as a trader in a distant town where no one knew his name or his father's crimes. He never sent word back to Ife, and Adewale never sent for him, because both men understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever peace existed between them could only survive at a distance. Adewale did not hate him. He had tried in the early days to feel something sharper than pity for the boy who had unknowingly worn his life like borrowed clothes, but hatred never quite settled in him the way he expected it to. Some mornings he wondered whether Kunle woke in his